All right, so we'll go ahead and kick off into our agenda, and then as folks continue to join, we'll get them caught up. So um, for today's session, we're going to go through, and again, this is going to be a bit of a repeat for anyone who has joined us previously. We're going to talk through the visual representation considerations, same thing we talked about in previous sessions. We'll go through some important design considerations. This is a bit of a change from the way we've previously done this. We're going to focus on some common weakness and common design flaws, and then how we can maybe draw our diagram to account for those particular items to make sure that we are including secure by design, secure by default principles in our diagram. So specifically calling out those items, and then we'll jump into areas risk and kind of show you what that looks like. So visual representation questions. The first question there is it meaningful? So if I'm considering what should I include in my diagram, the first question I ask is, does this matter, right? Does it improve the scope? Is it going to improve the quality of my diagram? And here for this item, so like, for example, if you have a threat model, and we think about threat modeling in 3 layers, if I've got my environmental layer, my infrastructure layer, and my functional layer, do I always need to include the environmental layer, right? What bearing does it have on this specific threat model? And you're welcome to exclude that, but just know that obviously that has an impact. You don't always have to include it, but you certainly can, right? Security impacting. Does this representation impact the security? There is very much a trade-off between, okay, I'm going to diagram every little bitty thing, but that may not have any positive impact on the final diagram that you're working with inside of areas risk, right? So the focus on our diagram is ultimately going to be, what is the most important aspect of our security picture and our security representation? And that's ultimately what we're going to focus on today, especially with overlaying some of our weaknesses and our common design considerations with our IoT device. The third factor is maximizing returns, right? The more time I spend on a diagram, it's quite likely the less valuable it becomes. So for example, the diagram that I worked on today, I think I spent about an hour and a half on the diagram, maybe another 30 minutes, researching and overlaying the weaknesses on that diagram. So, not a ton of time. I certainly wouldn't spend, more than 2 hours on a diagram, unless it's just exceedingly complicated and needs to be exceedingly complicated, right? A good diagram, I should be able to look at it, pass that off to somebody else, and they should be able to clearly see what's the most important scope of my diagram. And lastly, what do internal, external stakeholders expect, right? Obviously, it's great to have an opinion about what's important in your diagram, but if your boss or an auditor expects something particular, you're going to have to obviously meet those expectations. Now, in an ideal situation, we know what those expectations are because they've been documented and communicated by senior leadership. So that's something to take into consideration to make sure we've actually got those things documented. If you are a senior leader, what documentation have you provided for what should that threat model look like? Where should I have trust zones? When should I use trust zones? Which trust zones should I use? And then what other relevant metadata is expected on that particular diagram? So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move over into the design considerations. So when we're thinking about IoT, for example, and we'll make this available. Basically, I'm referencing a couple different links in here, but when we're talking about IoT representation, so some of the things that get called out that are common weaknesses with IoT devices, one of which is weak or hardened passcodes, so passwords that are hard-coded in our devices or hard-coded within that IoT infrastructure. You have to consider the insecure network that device may be connecting to. And I do see this frequently, especially with like medical device IoT and just think wearable IoT devices. You have to consider that's connecting to someone's home network. We obviously don't know anything about that network, and you can assume that it's basically internet trust zone attack surface, insecure ecosystem interfaces. So is it connecting to another API, and that API is inherently insecure? What else is it connecting to? You could also think about this as the mobile device that it's connecting to, right? So if it's connecting to that mobile device and that mobile device is jailbroken, has side-loaded applications which are insecure, and they're collecting data from there. So you have to take into account that consideration as you're designing it. Insecure update mechanisms, so ensuring that we are performing updates in a secure manner. Insecure outdated components, lack of proper privacy considerations. Obviously, privacy within threat modeling is I'll say it's more of an emerging topic than maybe some of the other concepts we talk about. But just know where the data is, how's it being stored, how's it being protected, what unique identifiers do I have for that individual, both on the device if compromised, and then as well as anywhere else that data is being stored, aggregated, or processed. Insecure data transfer and storage, so take into consideration where is data being stored on the device. If that device is syncing to a mobile phone, what data do I have being synced on the mobile device, and then where is that data going from there? Improper device management, so what are my expectations for that end user? If I'm expecting an end user to manually update a device, how often is that being done? As I was thinking about this, I have one of those, robo vacuums for around the house. I can guarantee I have not thought about updating the firmware or the operating system on that device since I got it. Right, I have not updated that app. It's just sitting in a dormant state on my phone right now because it's been mothballed essentially. Right. Insecure default settings. So the recommendation is always secure by default. If you have the ability to turn on a security function, make it so the user either can't disable that or has to turn it off by default. And then lack of physical hardening. And obviously this is both from we want to protect intellectual property, so we want to make sure that device can't be opened up and reviewed. We also want to make sure that device is secure and can't be tampered with either in transit or by someone else, right? So with those considerations in mind around common vulnerabilities, let's go ahead and let's jump over into serious risk now. Okay, and so now let's take a look at this diagram, and I'm going to show this in layers. And this is actually something that I don't see Brenna on here, but Brenna Leith, she's a common frequent speaker at ThreatModCon, and she's really involved in the Threat Modeling Connect community. She has kind of used layers in the past to demonstrate how I can kind of demonstrate different information about my threat model based on who my audience is. And I won't steal her thunder because she's got a lot of cool information that I hope she's able to share with us. But I'm going to apply a little bit of that concept here, and you'll be able to see, for example, here's my diagram, and then as I bring in this second layer, I can actually demonstrate that I have different sets of weaknesses by overlaying that on top of my diagram. And this is just a native draw.io functionality. But the nice thing about this is, depending on who is looking at my threat model, I can showcase different pieces of information. And in this example, I wanted to showcase that I have different weaknesses being brought in and considered based on my design. Now, the tricky thing here is that obviously, depending on how these kind of work and function, you don't want these overlapping with components. So you kind of have to have them around the border and around the periphery to have this work well. So I'm going to hide this for just a second as we kind of talk about what the central design looks like. So starting with where would my end user most likely interact with this? I did create this app, and any component I have here circled in red, that's actually a component that I built for today's discussion, right? So I built this iOS app store, and if we go over, I'll actually show you what this component looks like behind the scenes, right? So I went through and I created this component, and I believe I just cloned an existing component. Give this just a second to load, and then I'll come back. So from my iOS app store, I then have the mobile application, which is downloaded, nested inside my IoT operating system. And notice I'm just using a parent-child relationship here to nest this, right? That operating system's on my client. That client has access to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. From my Wi-Fi port, I'm then communicating with my home router. Home routing, communicating back to my my SaaS environment here, or my hosted cloud environment, where maybe I'm aggregating data about different people. So if I'm managing those devices, or if I'm collecting any user metrics or user data, all of that's being aggregated and analyzed by my augmented AI here. Obviously, I've got some kind of cloud CloudTrail, log management system in place here. So I've given a brief overview of what these things are. And then as I come back to my actual device, I've got Bluetooth to Bluetooth. I've got my IoT application. I've got my embedded storage system here. And I did create this component as well, and we'll go look at what that looks like. I've got some database on my embedded storage, and then I've got some sensor, which is then collecting data. And these are all coming from my functional component library. So functional component, this is my IoT library. I think this is my generic library, generic, IoT library, IoT. This is my IoT as well. So a lot of these are default components. The ones that I did build, let's go look at those. So if I go into objects, components, and then I want to look specifically at my one for, I think I did, was it iOS? So I click back over so I don't forget what it was. I have embedded storage and I have iOS App Store. So iOS App Store, and that iOS App Store component is grabbing this IoT secure supply chain and production risk pattern, right? So I went through, created new component, and then added my comment, placed it inside of a category, added a photo to it. I did not create this, so if there's anyone here from Apple, I did borrow that from the World Wide Web. Appreciate you guys making that available. And then I've added my source of threats from my IR library. So I've actually just added a supply chain and production risk pattern to that, which was a relevant threat I saw coming in here. Now, you will notice on here, I do have this. I could have listed this as trusted partner, and that's what I have it listed as here. I have to unlock my background layer to make changes. I could have also listed that I have a out of scope region on here. And this is where we talked about it's important to manage scope on your threat model. I could have also placed that iOS app inside of an out of scope region, showing that that particular item is upstream, but not in scope for my given threat model. Then I can go ahead and update my model from there. The other one that I grabbed was the embedded system, right? Or embedded storage, excuse me. And from here, again, I created the new component, placed a name, placed it in a category. I don't have a description for it. I did make it visible for my diagram. And then I went into my IR hardware component library and I just grabbed the generic hardware risk pattern and I've mapped it to my embedded storage, right? So two components that I created, and again, created those really on the fly. So that was no more than a minute or two to go through and create these different components. Now, obviously, I'm fortunate that I know where the risk patterns are, so I recognize that I have a bit of a luxury there. But I wouldn't expect creating a component on the fly would take very long. You could have also just created something like this. I know we've talked about the use of empty components before. So if I wanted to show that, maybe I have some kind of external video interface, right? I'm placing an empty component on here, which doesn't have a risk pattern, but I'm placing it on my diagram. And then now as I update my model, I'll be able to attach sets of risk to this video interface, right? Inside of my threats and inside of my threats interface. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and lock my background layer, and I'm going to go ahead and reveal my common vulnerability layer. And all I'm doing here is I am just aligning the design considerations from the previous screen that I had on the slide deck with now on my threat model, right? So lack of privacy controls. What kind of data am I storing? How is that data stored? How is it aggregated? Outdated components. What is the age of these components? Insecure update mechanisms. How are these things being updated? Weak or hard-coded passwords. Where am I storing passwords at? How am I managing secrets? Lack of physical hardening. How is this device designed to prevent someone from opening it up and compromising it on a physical basis? And obviously, I don't really have any representation of the physical casing here, right? But you could, if you wanted to, you could outlay this and diagram this exactly the way the device appears in real life. So if you wanted to, change the shape of my video interface here, of course I have to unlock my background again. I can change the shape of these. I can move them down, move them around, right? Depending on where I want them to be inside of my diagram. Um, Insecure ecosystem interfaces, right? So how is it interfacing with the ecosystem? As a potential that this outside device might be insecure that it's interacting with. Insecure network. So consider the operation that it may be operating in an insecure network completely. Insecure default settings, right? So a lot of times if we're setting up an IoT device, unless it's, I'm assuming this is like a consumer product, it's oftentimes set up, by that mobile device in the process, right? So they're connecting to that device. They're then going through setup and it's downloading and updating the firmware on the device. So insecure default settings, improper device management, insecure update mechanisms, which is repeated, right? Because there's a possibility that I have updates pending on the IoT device as well as updates on my mobile device. Because if my IoT mobile application is compromised, I then have those items going downstream into my other device, right? Into my IoT device. Outdated components, right? Which would again indicate to how frequently this is getting updated. And then as I start moving up into my cloud, I have insecure data transfer or storage again, right? Because if I have data, being moved from my home network to the cloud, there's a possibility for man-in-the-middle attacks here. I have the concept like lack of privacy controls again, because how am I using this data? Right, and there are good frameworks out there. I know Lindunn's a great framework for assessing, and they have both a really, really nice, neat, quick card game based, version that lets us go through and evaluate privacy risk and controls very quickly. We also have, the more systematic one, and the name escapes me off the top of my head. I know Maestro, I think, is the one they're coming out with, which I'm not sure if it hasn't been released or if it's a paid tier. But again, a good resource as well for navigating privacy controls and privacy threat modeling inside of Ares Risk. So with that being said, right, here's my model, and I'll go ahead and update that model one more time. And then if we go over and start looking at, if I go over to the home page here, you'll see that this designated and this created a total of 136 threats and 311 countermeasures. And you can see 26 critical, 79 high, 2 medium, and I've already got some that are being auto implemented here. Inside of my tenant, I'm using a couple secure by design libraries where I've gone through and said, okay, in my AWS environment, I'm automatically implementing these 15 countermeasures, right? And those are things like administrators have their own accounts. We can actually go over and look at some of those. So if we drop over into threats now, I'll go ahead and auto expand what I'm working with here. And you'll be able to see some of the ones that I've already completed here. So attackers gain unauthorized access, log to dedicate and centralize S3 bucket. That's already being done. Control access to VPC resources. So this is already being done. And I've gone through and I've pre-established that control just by starting with the review of the AWS environment. And this is where that threat modeling in 3 layers concept comes back in, because if I've already threat modeled the environment, my production environment factors and variables, I can quite confidently go through and start reducing some of my countermeasures by 20 or 30%, because those are environmental layers. Or if I get into the infrastructure layer and I've got an S3 bucket, if we're using that same configuration, I can probably go through and mark many of those countermeasures already being implemented over time, because I know that we're deploying in the same method, we're deploying in the same manner. And remember, there's a difference between implemented and implemented verified. Implemented verified would also mean that not only am I saying it's done, but someone's actually gone through and they've verified that item is actually complete and intact. Okay. So as I look at this, the next thing I want to maybe look through is I can either go through, I could sort based on, current risk of critical, high, medium. The first thing I absolutely want to do is I want to go through and remove my out of scope component. Because remember, we did have one that was out of scope. And I'll go ahead and just collapse this back down. So I've got my out of scope component. I've got my one nest component, which is my iOS App Store with one threat. So not a lot of an impact here. And I'm going to go ahead and just go up and use my bulk actions here to move this into an NA status. It's just one, so the bulk action is not available. NA, and I'll just say out of scope for this model. Okay. And then, from here, I'm going to go ahead and move into a flattened threat view position. And I'm going to start by reviewing and there's a couple different ways we could prioritize this, right? So if we're moving into our next step, I'm either thinking about, do I want to prioritize by device, so by subcomponent inside of the system, or do I want to prioritize by proximity to a data egress point, or do I want to prioritize based on criticality? So what's my current risk? Let's go ahead and take a look at it from the current risk perspective. So I go in and just select current risk of critical. It's then going to filter this down to, I think, just the 20 or so that I had that were current risk or higher, right? And you can see as I start going through, I see a lot of these attached to iOS device client. And then now I can start working my way through these different sets of threats and countermeasures inside of here, right? And you see I have a lot of overlap, right? So attackers gain access to unauthorized data by exploiting vulnerabilities. So if I have a robust process inside of here, and my suspicion is this is, restrict access service to network layer risk exposure. So many of these I may be able to auto remediate because I have a set of technical controls in my environment or at the infrastructure level that are going to let me go through and move these into an implemented state, right? So once I've gone through and I've assessed my criticals, I can then reduce my view further and go into my highs. And I think the highs had quite a few. So this would be a larger one, maybe beneficial to review it by component in that case based on data value. So, and one thing we didn't do, right, and this is just to call this back, because right now we see a lot of them in the same categories. What I haven't done is I haven't gone through and added any particular assets to any of my components. So for example, if I know that this database down here on my IoT device, let me unlock my background layer. I'm just going to hide that one. If I go into my database and go into my complete questionnaire, I can go through and I can see that I've got my assets here, and I can go into protected health information. I can say that I have information about that individual who's being stored, it's being sent, it's being received. And then now as I start to add those assets to different components, the desire is that as I add that asset, now a threat that would be potentially compromising to that asset, those things are going to start to float to the top because now I've added an asset, which is increasing my prioritization on those given items, and it's going to weight differently inside of my threat model. Okay. So I think that kind of takes us through, again, what's most important in my diagram, why it's laid out the way that it is, and then how we start to tie together sets of weaknesses with my particular representation inside of that diagram. So with that, let me pause, take a sip of coffee, and give you guys a chance to offer up any questions. I don't see anything at the moment on the chat or the question and answer, so feel free to fire a couple questions about this or just about diagramming and representation in general. And shooting, let me know if you see any questions on your side, either that we want to go through. Okay, so what about aggregated risk? And I presume, and feel free to expound upon that, but I'm assuming you mean, how do I measure, like if I've got another system inside of this system, right? How do I kind of roll that risk value up into a larger picture? Is that kind of what you're asking about? Or so from this perspective, we kind of have two different ways. Yeah, like a stepping stone approach. Okay. So from the big picture, we're able to see our total risk picture down here, right? So moving from inherent risk to current risk to projected risk. We could have used, and I'm reading into your stepping stone approach, and I'm going to try to infer what I think you're talking about. You could have started off with a much smaller diagram here, right? So for example, this has got my cloud infrastructure, which is likely shared among multiple threat models. I could have represented this by a project component. So it looks like I don't have a project component here, which is strange. But if I had a project component created, I could have represented this entire block right here by one component to show that I had it reaching up into another separate threat model of something that's already been threat modeled. I could have also done the same thing here, where I might have my operating system and my device client being threat modeled by one team, and then I have my generic hardware being threat modeled by another team, right? And in that case, I could have this entire thing represented by a single component as opposed to multiple components. So if we wanted to reduce our view and reduce our scope on this even further, we could absolutely, take some of these away and be able to have just one component. The thing you would want to do from there, though, is to be able to roll that risk up and be able to see that. Yeah, correct. Yeah, hierarchical approach. Thank you, Hans. So the ability to have multiple layers within your diagram, and that's kind of where again that 3-layer approach comes from, right? It sounds like you could focus more on just the functional layer of what the actual functions of the IoT device are actually doing. You could also have that functional layer interact with that infrastructure architectural layer as well. So, any hints for diagramming physical connections on the IoT device? So CAN bus USB ports. Yeah, that's a good one. So we do have, I think we've actually got several of those. So USB port, USB drive. So if I were to, it's going to get a little busy in here for just a second. So USB port. I think we also had, I think the CAN bus is actually my IEC library. Video camera, video conference system. So I know some of these components we have natively. On other ones, the risk patterns are going to be quite similar, right? So you're going to run into the same, kind of physical and data transfer weaknesses and vulnerability types. So I think you can duplicate a lot of these. We do have another library called the IEC 6443 library, which has a more complete list of those. I don't have it incorporated in this tenant at the moment. But you could represent them, through components like that. You could have also done, and I know earlier we kind of talked about the physical representation of how do we want to how do we want to lay out our different components for this particular hardware device. You could lay them out and have them match the exact same way the diagram is actually set up. So my interface here would look like your actual device. And then that's a nice way to bring in, someone who is a physical architect on the device, and they're actually seeing the actual device, and they're actually able to see what they've designed and how the risks and cyber risks and weaknesses also contribute to that design type. So that could be a good way to bring in, multiple crowds and multiple audiences. I guess I should mark a couple of these questions here. Okay. Any other questions? I know we're just about to the bottom of the hour. Any other questions? And if not, we'll jump off, and everyone will have a few minutes back in their afternoon or middle of their day. All right, cool. Well, everyone, I appreciate everyone coming in and participating. I love the questions, and if you do have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Shooting, and we will get you guys answers to those. As always, there will be a recap email that sends out if you register for this, and we'll make the template that I have here and have worked on available to you guys, as well as the PowerPoint deck that you guys saw at the beginning of the call. Okay. All right. Everyone have a good rest of your day, and thank you for your time.